Before we begin, would anybody here mind coming up forward a little bit closer so we can consolidate the room a little bit? We have a few cameras back here. I'm not quite sure why we want more people up here, but just to appear as if there's more people here that are not. Than there actually are.
We said to stay here? Do we know where?
Richard, you're good to go? Good? See the round dial?
Also, before we begin, I'd like to remind people to please silence or turn off their cell phones. All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our sermon tonight is hosted by the Secular Student Alliance. It's a campus-based club for students interested in discussing secular tenets and related ideologies. We plan diverse social events and movie screenings, moderate lively discussions, and host important debates. For more information, you can go to facebook.com/SSA UNR. I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, which is Matt Dillahunty. As a Southern Baptist for more than 20 years, Matt began a broad and prolonged investigation into all things religious in an attempt to bolster his faith and pursue his career in the ministry. As his investigation continued, he abandoned his faith and religion in favor of skepticism, logic, reason, and an affinity for the scientific method. His interest in apologetics assisted him in the creation of ironchariots.org, a website dedicated to responding to theistic arguments for the existence of God. Matt served as the president of the Atheist Community of Austin, 2005 to 2013, and co-hosted the group's atheist-orientated podcast, Nonprofits. And hosted the group's also public access television program, The Atheist Experience. The weekly program is produced live and takes live callers and listeners from around the Austin area and the world, prompting many debates and discussions on a variety of topics, including religious, philosophical, and skeptical topics. Please give him a warm round of applause.
It's so weird coming out from backstage and stuff. All right, wake up, laptop. So thanks for having me out. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Some of this is going to be very obvious. Some of it may seem a little overly pedantic. And I suspect I may be preaching mostly to the choir, but hopefully not. But after giving this talk a few times, I found that there are things that need to be included because of questions I was asked after giving this talk in the past. I last gave it 4 years ago, I think. I gave this lecture at a university for the first time. And the whole talk is about building the evaluation of secular moral systems. And when I finished, the very first question was from a young lady who said, I understand what you said, but where do atheists get their morals from? And I was like, I have failed catastrophically. So I'm not claiming to be an expert on morality or anything else. I'm just kind of giving my thoughts that I've put together over the years. And you are all already better credentialed than I am because I don't have a single credit hour in anything anywhere. I'm actually lobbying to be given like honorary degrees, maybe in philosophy. I'd rather get one in theology, but I'm not sure too many seminaries are going to be giving theology degrees to godless heathens. And also, everybody know the number of the beast? Yeah, but I've heard, and I haven't probably studied this a lot, that it may actually be incorrect, that it may be a false translation, and that the real number would be 616. Guess what room I'm in? Yeah, they didn't have a 666, so they gave me the correct one. All right, so 15 years ago or so, I was a fundamentalist Christian. I was convinced that the Christian Bible was the inspired word of the living God, and that the moral views that it contained were correct, immutable, and beyond question. My understanding of the views of the secular community were limited, to put it mildly, I can remember only 2 occasions where the subject ever came up. The first happened when I was fairly young. One afternoon I was flipping through channels and I paused at the Phil Donahue show. And there was a woman on the show who said something about Christianity. I don't even remember what, but it caught my attention. And my mother came charging into the room to change the channel, telling me that I wasn't allowed to watch that because this woman was an evil atheist who hated God, wanted to outlaw prayer, and turn the United States into a godless nation. I don't remember her exact words, but that's what stuck. Years later, I finally understood the woman in question was Madeline Murray O'Hara, who was on Donahue several times. It was, I think, his first guest, and maybe one of his last. The second memory is a little less clear. I remember hearing the phrase secular humanist at some point in the early 80s, perhaps, probably on the 700 Club, and I asked my mom what it meant. And again, I don't remember her exact words, but the impression that stuck was that secular humanist was just a fancy code word for atheist and that they were trying to pervert the world with their materialistic message. And that was it. For many years, that's all I knew about the secular perspective, and I was pretty sure that's all I needed to know. These weren't just souls that were in need of salvation. These were apostates who directly opposed God's moral law, and God had given them over to reprobate minds. They weren't beyond salvation, no one was, but they were working for Satan, though they may not realize it. Now, 15 years later, my mom is now convinced that I'm working for Satan and leading people to hell, and I'm probably never going to change that, and it makes me a little sad. I gave this lecture the first time just before Sam Harris published The Moral Landscape. Has anybody read it? Sure. Sam and I largely agree on moral issues, so you hear some things echoed. And, I think we were kind of coming to similar notions from different angles. And of course, once he wrote the book, I was like, well, I'm done with this talk. But I don't tend to give the same talk over and over, but somebody wanted me to talk about this, so we thought we'd do it today. So, morality is a huge subject, or collection of subjects, and one of the most commonly addressed subjects in discussion between theists and atheists. I've done lots of debates, and with the exception of the last debate that I did against Cy in May, every debate, no matter what the topic was supposed to be, came down to a question about morality. A grand lie has been spread, a lie that I used to believe, a lie that I hear or read on nearly a weekly basis, a lie that muddies the subject and preys on our intellectual laziness and fears. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none that doeth good. Psalm 14:1. You don't normally hear the last part because modern versions of Christianity and Judaism would acknowledge that, well, of course those godless heathens can do good things. We watch them do good things. And the general answer from Christendom is that we do it because God has written a moral code on our heart, and so we're compelled to do it even if we're turning against him. That's from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, and a prime reason why some of them are convinced that atheists are in fact immoral. One might ask them, or at least ask those who don't agree with this verse, why they don't. But then they'll just cite other interpretations because the literal words of their holy book don't mesh with reality. They don't have a good mechanism for change. The lie that begins by trying to claim that you can't have morals without some external authority, and then capitulating that you actually can, but that these morals are somehow inferior, or that they actually come from this external authority even if you don't recognize it. Today, I hope to put an end to both halves of that lie and acknowledge that secular morals are actually superior in almost every demonstrable way. So, secular moral systems are superior because I said so. Any questions? That's it. That is actually terrible. I mean, I think most of us discovered really early in our childhood that because I said so is one of the least satisfying answers you can get to anything. The fact that a response isn't satisfying doesn't mean it's not true. And I'm not arguing in this particular talk about, I moved ahead, about the idea that it's not true. But the reason we're disappointed by the response is what we're actually looking for is some sort of explanation, a response that increases our understanding, because we want to either accept or reject the proposition, and we prefer a good reason to do so. My goal here is to demonstrate that upon a fair analysis, that's kind of loaded language, but I'll stick with it. Almost anyone would agree or should agree that secular moral systems are superior, provided that we can agree that our goal is to create a better world, or using Sam's language, increase well-being. So the moral-immoral determination is based on an evaluation of an act with respect to a standard or value. Positive evaluations are labeled moral or morally good and right, and negative evaluations are labeled immoral or morally evil and wrong. Morally neutral assessments may either be truly neutral, or it may simply be so complex or subjective that a clear evaluation may not currently be possible. It makes no difference, though, whether the standard is ultimately the source of a subjective opinion or an objective truth. I can't see this, and they're out of sync, so we'll see what we do. We're still able to objectively assess actions with respect to this standard. Consider the game of chess, for example. The rules of chess could be viewed as entirely arbitrary and subjective. They could have come about through careful thought, play testing, and years of evolving gameplay, or they might have just been arbitrary and stuck. But even if they're subjective, we can still make objective assessments about the game. Irrespective of the source of the rules, we can assess the actions that we take with respect to those rules. Pawns can only move diagonally when capturing, either normally or en passant. This is the rule, and if you move your pawn diagonally under any other circumstances, you are wrong with respect to those rules. This is one of the basic rules of the game. It's a restriction or limit on the types of moves you can make. Let's see. I'll do this the hard way. The rules of chess aren't analogous to morals. They're more analogous to the physical truths about the reality we inhabit, the rules of the game that we're playing right now, called life. The rules of chess are rigid and externally imposed, just as the physical facts about reality are externally imposed. But there's an aspect of chess that's analogous to morality, and that is the strategy of actually playing the game. Would it be fair to say that the strategy is subjective? Certainly. But as long as the goal is to win the game, or to avoid losing at a minimum, then we're able to evaluate that strategy with respect to the goal objectively. And each individual can have their own strategy, and we can evaluate each of those strategies to see how they meet the goals. It would be dishonest to imply that because different people have different strategies, that we are, as a collective, somehow unable to say anything about which strategy is superior. We judge the strategy by comparing its results to the goals, and then compare those results to assess which strategies are superior. The determination of whether a particular strategy is superior or inferior is based on that assessment. We can identify actions that are better or worse, even if we're unable to identify absolutes or clearly define the best move. In a game of chess, there are a number of different options, and some are clearly better than others. Just as we can identify that, generally speaking, if our goal is to cultivate a friendship, we're more likely to succeed by giving a gift than stealing their car. We can easily identify these extremes, but there's a broad spectrum of possibilities in between. And that's where some people want to appeal to external authorities that tend to oversimplify the options. There's a broad range of possibilities between offering a gift and stealing somebody's car. And the test of a strategy is in determining how accurately and efficiently it assists you in placing those in that spectrum. As the complexity increases, the risk of competing values and goals increases. You guys can just probably ignore the slides. Okay. So as the complexity increases, the risk of competing values and goals increase. Just because we've determined that getting someone a gift is better than stealing their car doesn't mean we've determined that getting them a gift is actually the best move. It may, in fact, be a bad move, but it's probably still better than taking their car. One advantage of secular morality is that we can assess any strategy on its own merits, and we can use those obvious extremes as guidelines to help filter the scenarios that are less obvious or even morally neutral. So there's a number of different considerations that I'm going to address as we go through this. Maybe I'll get this slide right. What is the origin of the core values and the goals of each system? Whose interests are served? How does each system handle the issue of justification and authority? How does each system address the need for modifications and alterations of values and goals? And what process does each use for resolving conflict about values? And then how robust or flexible is the system? You will, unplug my laptop. You will quickly sense the trend here. I'm including core values and goals in the definition of moral system, even though technically speaking, that's wrong and I shouldn't do that. They're not truly part, the goals, the values that you set, they're what you compare it to. So they're not truly part of the system of evaluation, but they're a critical aspect, and so I want to go ahead and make sure that they were in here as well. So imagine you're going to design a game, or a game system, or a government system. Is your goal to design it with the best interests of the participants in mind? Is your goal to make a system that's profitable for you? And note the profitability may be a direct result of making a good game that players actually appreciate, so you might want to take their thoughts and desires into consideration. But what if you allowed all participants to contribute? And that's what we're talking about here. Are you going to build a system that you want to participate in, or a system that you simply control? How do you determine the core values that will serve as a foundation for the system? What consideration are you giving the interests and desires of the participants? In secular moral systems, and I'm going to interject a little caveat here because it's been a while since I did this talk, and since then I've changed my view. It's not that secular moral systems are superior, it's that they're the only real moral systems. Religions don't have systems, they have pronouncements about moral views. There's no mechanism by which to evaluate things that aren't already included in the written text. In secular systems, the source of core values is internal to the system. It's predicated on the views, both rational and emotional, of those within the system. The primary focus is on well-being and the betterment of the individuals within the system, and that will involve balancing those interests with the interests of the group, the interests of the individuals of the group. In non-secular systems, if there were any, the source is external to the system. It's predicated on, it's external to the system, and it isn't necessary. There's no necessary back up. In non-secular systems, the source is external to the system. There isn't necessarily a direct link to the values, needs, desires, or goals of the players. By external, we might mean external in a transcendent sense with perhaps a god, or merely external in the above the law sense. The idea that someone could impose the law and be above the law is probably one of the most unjust things I can think of, and is traditionally opposed in all areas outside of religion. Or we could mean that the external authority is no longer applicable, no longer involved. Somebody wrote this down and set it rolling, and we're just going to go with what they said, whether they're a god or Hammurabi or whoever. The key point is that non-secular systems are predicated on appeal to some external source for those values. There's a reason students, for example, tend to rely on guidance counselors to help define goals, instead of having those guidance counselors dictate assigned studies and then taking whatever you're stuck with. How many students would have preferred to decide their own major on their own interests? In situations like that, we can benefit from the wisdom of others, but we ultimately are forging our own path. It's true that you might wind up being happy if somebody else picks your major for you. Somebody could get it right, but is it likely? And is it the best course? It's true that you might wind up miserable making your own choices. But does that mean you've made a mistake in applying your own thoughts to try to guide your own path? Not necessarily. But one path allows the freedom to change your mind and to seek happiness on a different path. The other one doesn't. When I sidetrack for a second to talk about purpose, because it's come up many times. Chris Johnson just released his book, A Better Life, that includes comments from a lot of people in the secular community, and he's producing a movie actually, a documentary with the video footage he shot. And I was also set down for an interview with a guy in Fargo, North Dakota, who's a Christian who's producing a documentary called something I've forgotten. But it's all about meaning and purpose, and he's interviewing theists and atheists on meaning and purpose in life. And the thing that I find curious about this is this idea of an externally imposed purpose. if somebody, I know there are some cultures that indoctrinate people to be okay with the idea that we're going to pick your spouse for you. But generally speaking, outside of indoctrination, people don't want somebody else to pick their spouse. They don't want somebody else to pick their major. They don't want somebody else to tell them what their job's going to be. If the government tried to do this, all of these individuals who love the fact that they are convinced that God has given them some incredible mission and purpose in life, that their life is to, the purpose of their life is to live for God, they love that, and they would scream bloody murder if the government started dictating purpose in that same way. Why is that? Why is it that only in that context of either a God or a religiously imposed identity are people suddenly okay with being a puppet? When we're talking about secular moral systems, one of the things we have to address is whose interests are served. Secular systems, by default, serve the interests of those within the system. Now, that's not necessarily true. I'm basically going to good secular systems because it's possible to have absolutely crappy secular moral systems. People can be wrong about stuff. But non-secular systems may or may not serve the interests of those within the system, and there's no likelihood that that's the case. And when you look at what religions tend to do on behalf of morality, it doesn't seem to be the case that they're actually working in the interests of the people who are going to be living in this system. And one of the most common objections that I get from theists in particular is, well, God is way wiser than you, and he knows what's best. You could look at it like a parent or a doctor giving a kid a shot. That kid thinks he's being harmed, but the parents know that they're doing what's best for them. And the response to that is, I'm not a kid. And when kids grow up, they understand why their parents did certain things. Oh, well, you'll grow up when you get to heaven or hell, and you get the answers then. But that's not good enough if I'm going to be judged on the conclusions that I reach while I'm here. And so if there's a God who made me and gave me a brain, and I am somehow incapable of understanding his motivations, that's his problem, not mine. And if I'm going to be judged by it, then he's a moral thug. Non-secular systems may claim to be in the interest of players, yet they ultimately conform to some external opinion of what's in the best interest of players without any consideration to their interests. Was it any consolation to hear a parent say, I'm doing this for your own good? Not at the time. You had to learn something to realize that they might have been doing it for your own good. And by the way, there's a lot of parents who are doing a lot of things saying that it's for the kid's own good. They're wrong. Like not vaccinating. Sidetrack. Religions often encourage adherents to live for their God rather than for themselves. Not all of them, not all the time. But they also often encourage them to live for others. And that's a good thing. They also criticize seculars as living for themselves. But there's nothing wrong with living for yourself. I think we all do it. I don't think anything is truly altruistic. And I don't think that makes anybody bad. Because you can live for yourself and others. The key recognition is that you are stuck in this environment where you have to share space with people, where your actions have consequences for yourself and on other people. And by helping others in the world, you improve the world that you're living in and then benefit from, which is why I don't think there's necessarily true altruism. But putting yourself first is normal, and it is not the equivalent of hedonistic debauchery to put yourself first, which is the way it is often portrayed. Oh, you just wanted to sin. I get that all the time. But right after, why did you get mad at God? Which wasn't the case, and I'll tell my story some other time. But I also get you just wanted to sin. Okay, I don't necessarily think that that's accurate. But for those people who did leave their religion because they wanted to sin, isn't it probably because that religion defines who they are and what they are as sinful and wrong, with no demonstration that it actually is wrong? I mean, if you're gay and religion's telling you that you're wrong to be that way, it's never going to feel that way. And it poisons people's minds to the point where they feel terrible about themselves and who they are. It causes so many problems. Slides. Uh-oh. Oh, it helps if you actually push the button that does this. There we go. So one of the other aspects to deal with is where does the justification and the authority come from? And not just about individual interests, but about the core values and the process of enforcing them. Secular systems are self-organized, they are modified and enforced internally. Hopefully, as we'll see a little later, these internal values are founded on external facts about the reality we inhabit. Non-secular systems rely on this external authority for each of these. The key point to note is that internal authorities are accepted and external authorities are imposed. The issue isn't one of whether or not the ultimate source of an externally imposed system exists or not. I'm not here to, well, okay, guys probably don't exist, but that's not the point of this. The moral system exists whether the source is real or fictional. You could create a moral system based on Dumbledore, and somebody probably has. I mean, the internet's a wacky place. And as I've noted before, I don't believe a biblical God exists, but if it does, that doesn't mean that its views are correct, and it doesn't mean that I should recognize its authority. It may be the case that the correct moral action, if in fact there was a God who was making judgments based on its moral values, that the correct moral action would be to oppose that being, just as it would be for any ruthless dictator. If you got a bill for a service that you never signed up for, would you simply pay it? That's really what religions are asking people to do. Oh, we know you didn't really sign up for this. We know we're going to pass on the sins of the Father to you, etc. And here's this God who's got a moral code that he wants you to abide by. Wait a minute. I don't remember signing up for that or agreeing to any of this. How is it that I automatically fall underneath this authority? The justification for the authority of secular moral systems is the demonstration that the results conform to the goals, just as the justification for claiming winning strategy in chess. Yeah, the slides suck. Just ignore it. Claiming winning strategy in chess is that it actually wins or avoids a loss. Secular moral systems are not simply fiat declarations. They're not merely opinions, and they're not necessarily relativistic assertions. The authority comes from the participants' appeal to reality. Moral relativism has a fairly specific definition within philosophical moral circles, and that is that something is morally correct if a society deems it morally correct. And I absolutely abhor that version of moral relativism. I think it's obviously wrong. And that's why it's the one that comes under attack most often from religionists, because I think most people recognize that it's obviously wrong. And instead, when we're building good secular systems, we're appealing to the facts about reality, because we are physical beings in a physical universe. And until the universe changes such that stabbing you with a knife actually gives you a warm fuzzy and makes your life better, it's morally wrong. So when it comes to how do we go about modifying and altering these systems? Oh, no, not too far. I should ignore them. I should take my own advice. How do you modify and alter secular systems? It's internal and it's dynamic. The system not only permits change, it encourages change. Secular moral systems have as a primary goal the best interests of the participants. And if that's your primary goal and you discover that a secondary goal that you've put in place are conflicting with that primary goal, you've identified a problem, and the participants are the architects of the system, they are now free, if not actually obligated, to make changes. This hierarchical system builds upon not only the primary goals, but on the information that we gain from applying the system to our regular interactions. Secular values can change based on new information. Hey, look, this group doesn't like being treated like second-class citizens. Maybe we should do something about that, and then it's better for everybody. There's this type of recognition is acknowledging a conflict in the system, and maybe we should work towards equality. Hey, women are people too. Imagine that. And these different views can also be weighted with respect to each other. We don't need to consider every value equivalent. Chess is a great game. In case you didn't know, I play a little chess, which is why I reference it about 1,000 times in this talk. But what if we found a way to improve it? What if we had house rules that we'd alter? And as long as we're in agreement on the new rules, everything's fair. We can change the rules, we can change what strategies we use, and as we discover problems, if we were to solve chess, in other words, determine that given perfect play, whoever goes first is going to win, lose, draw, whatever, we can then alter the game, and that will perhaps be more enjoyable to play, because that new verse is not necessarily solved. We can't alter the facts about reality, which are directly analogous to the rules of chess. But we can alter our strategies once we learn more about reality so that we know how better to direct ourselves. Secular moral systems don't just allow us to change the game a little bit, because we do manipulate reality a smidgen, but they allow us to change with the game. The universe is dynamic, it changes, and our understanding of it changes, and we need to have a system that's flexible enough to acknowledge those changes. Non-secular systems don't normally permit changes, or if they do, those changes come from an external source. They're generally rigid, resistant to change, and they still may not consider the best interest of the participants when they do change, which means the changes aren't tied to the benefit of those people. This static or sluggish nature ensures that non-secular moral systems are constantly in danger of having the world pass them by. This is one of the reasons why religions die and change. It's another reason that we have over 1,000 denominations that all identify as Christian, with generally similar labels pointing to the same book, who disagree on every single point of doctrine, right down to whether or not Jesus was an actual historical figure. Why is it that the book can be very explicit about, let's say, slavery, and yet no Christian I've ever met endorses slavery the way the Bible does? At least not met in person. I think I've heard some people on the internet are desperate to make their Bible relevant at all costs. But generally speaking, what's happened is they have been moved out of the Dark Ages by changes in the culture, including secular moral systems that surround them. And it just becomes just so. Oh, what do you hear most often? Oh, that's the Old Testament. What? Are you just going to chuck out the Old Testament? The biggest part of your Bible? And most of it, even if you're Jewish? You're going to chuck out the book that has your origin story, the fall from grace that requires the substitutionary atonement for salvation? You're going to toss out all the prophecies that you think Jesus fulfilled? That's just the Old Testament. We're in the New Testament now. Every time I hear that, I know that they don't know anything about the Bible. There's no way you can know about the Bible and make claims like that. It's just bizarre. So how do you go about resolving conflicts? In the handful of debates that I've had that have been specifically about morality, one of the most common objections, which is why I wrote all these, because these are all based on the most common objections. That way I don't have to answer so many questions. Oh, I will. One of the most common objections is, well, if there is no absolute authority for you to point to, then it's all just opinions and you don't have any way to resolve it. I mean, if you think this is moral and this other group over here thinks it's immoral, how do you resolve that? And my answer is, you're in exactly the same boat. Every denomination of Christianity has different views about morality. You have no way to reconcile it. Each one of you is going to point to the Bible and you're going to pick out different verses. And then you have no way of reconciling your agreed upon version of Christian morality with what the Muslims think, or the Jains, or the Hindus, or the Scientologists. There's still going to be the conflict. How is it resolved? Secular systems, if they're done right, are data and results driven and tend to rely on debate, discussion, and the evaluation of evidence. These are the ideals. Obviously, we don't always live up to those ideals, and we're all imperfect, and we can't always rely on others to be convinced by reason and evidence. But generally speaking, secular systems are inclusive and participatory. And the more people who willingly adopt secular systems, which, by the way, is almost everybody, as I'll get to later, the easier it becomes to resolve conflicts. If we agree that our authority is good evidence and sound argument, we now have a mechanism to seek agreement. Critical thinking skills, skepticism, and reasoning may be the greatest things we can ever teach another person. Non-secular systems rely on coercion and conversion. Conversion attempts often purport to rely on evidence, but aren't tied to the evidence, and they'll resort to emotional appeals or force when the evidence doesn't support the system. How have most religions spread? They become a part of the dominant culture, which then spreads as those people spread. You know, you're a Hindu because your parents were Hindu. You're a Baptist because your parents were Baptist. There are exceptions, but those are exceptions to a very strong norm. Generally speaking, non-secular moral systems, religious systems, are divisive. Consider a world where there were no secular moral systems, a world where we simply had competing claims, all citing the supreme authority of their particular deity, sacred text, or great thinker. How do they settle disputes? Without direct evidence, we're forced to make fallacious appeals to emotion, popularity, purported consequences like hell, and direct threats. Convert or die seems to be a rather common thread. As we've seen from the patriarch of the Duck Dynasty family, it's not just limited to certain Muslim sects. Religions will often claim that secular moral systems are just relativistic opinions with no hope of resolution. The truth is that secular moral systems have the greatest hope of resolution, peaceful resolution, as their strong unifying authority of reason and evidence, which most religionists will accept on almost every topic outside of their religion. So I included robustness, and then I realized it might actually not be a good characteristic. Do we really care if it's a robust system? I kind of think we do, but I'm not sure. Because complexity is not necessarily a good thing, but if you live in a complex world, it might be kind of necessary. The secular systems are more complex because they've been allowed to evolve and mature. Because they've been modified to adapt situations in the past, there are, relatively speaking, fewer new situations for them to address. Now, it's tough to say fewer new situations in a dynamic world because there's going to be an endless parade of situations for them to address, but at least they've knocked some of them off. We're building up a wealth of knowledge standing on the shoulders of giants. Additionally, we're able to spend more energy focusing on new situations that don't clearly fit into the previously assessed sets of values, rather than continually treading water and trying to solve the same problems over and over and over again. We're trying to improve our moral understanding to fit new scenarios, rather than trying to force these new scenarios into our pre-molded moral views. Because they're less flexible, because they're immutable and resistant to change, non-secular systems tend to remain simplistic. Thou shalt not kill. That is nowhere near robust enough to figure out all the myriad situations. Look at the United States Criminal Code regarding killing another person. This isn't necessarily morals, this is law, but there's a decent amount of overlap. There's a thoughtful process that's taken place trying to be fair, trying to encourage well-being and improve the situation for everybody. And thou shalt not kill doesn't go far enough. We have something complex, like if I run over you with my car, is that murder? What degree murder? First degree, second degree, third degree? Is it felony murder? Is it manslaughter? Was it an accident? Is it negligent homicide? Maybe it's suicide. Maybe you dove behind my car. Where are the verses that deal with those subjects? They don't exist. And that's where we end up with the church leaders and their interpretations to narrow this down. So now, what is their authority? Reality. They've recognized that their founders, be they human or supernatural, left them with insufficient means to evaluate all these different situations. We recognize that motive and intent are relevant in assessing the moral character of an act. Thou shalt not kill. Really? All the time? There's self-defense. Maybe clearly that wasn't a motivation to do harm. It was maybe perhaps a motivation to defend yourself or defend others. There's not a great deal of thought that goes into the simplified versions. Imagine you have two children and they misbehave when you take them out in public. And you take them home and you talk to them, and one of them, you say, if you'll behave in public, you're going to get dessert, and if you don't, we're going to beat you. By the way, don't do that. And the other one, you sit down and you explain that their actions have consequences for other people, and that if they're being a disruption of tenor, it's annoying and bothering other people. And how would they feel if they were trying to have a conversation and somebody was doing this? And you build up empathy and understanding. Now, the next time you go out to dinner, both of those kids behave. Which one's more moral? Well, on some evaluation, they're equally moral because their actions are now the same. They are both going to behave. But the motivation behind it's important, because what happens when mom and dad aren't there? Which one now has a better foundation to make decisions about how to act in other situations when the carrot and the stick are gone? I would hope that all of us realize, despite the fact that they're both well behaved in public, one of them has clearly developed a superior moral system, even if they both have the same view on a particular action. As secular humanists, we tend to acknowledge being good for the sake of being good is superior to having other motivations, which sounds like I'm saying altruism's real, but I'm not. So the absence of a complete and clearly defined standard is not the equivalent of having no values or no way to construct a standard. The most common objections to secular moral systems are based on the flawed argument that an absence of a clearly defined best strategy is the equivalent to having no strategy at all, or that the dissent of any individual with respect to a best strategy necessarily undermines the significance of consensus among the rest of them. This is simply wrong. You may be able to find someone who sincerely thinks that it would be moral to kill all the lawyers, but that doesn't change the fact that we can clearly identify this as wrong. Everyone is entitled to their opinions about reality, but all opinions are not of similar significance because they don't all accurately conform to reality. While those of us, not those of us, it's not me, while those who want to kill all the lawyers are entitled to their opinion, we're not in any way obligated to give their opinions any special weight when we're constructing a moral system that evaluates this, in part because it's ours, the system, but also because we already know that this action leads to results which are contrary to the goal of a healthy and productive society. We already know this is a bad move, but we're pretty sure it's a bad move, and at a minimum, that's what my lawyer told me to say. So consider, for example, the legal movement of a knight on a chessboard. Hey, we're back to chess again. If you ask somebody to describe how a knight moves, one of them might say, the knight moves orthogonally one square and then diagonally one square. Those are the real chess speeds. Another player may describe it as the knight moves orthogonally 2 squares and then to an adjacent orthogonal square on a different path from the original trajectory. Somebody else might just say up 2 and over 1 or up 1 and over 2. They're all correct. And there's no problem with the descriptions because the net effect is the same. But if they say that the knight can jump to any open square on the board, they're wrong. It doesn't matter that there's one of them out there saying it, stamping their foot, saying, no, 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 this is the way it is. They're still wrong. And we only have to appeal to the rules of the game, the objective truth about reality to know this. So what if you ask players, given a specific chess position, what's the best move and what's the worst move? For some positions, the answer is going to be really, really obvious. If you're one move from mate, that's obviously the best move. Unless perhaps your goal is to punish the other person rather than just winning the game, but now you're playing another game. In other situations, for other positions, there is no easy, obvious answer. But the fact that we don't have an easy, obvious best move doesn't mean we can't evaluate moves to see which ones are better. Doesn't mean that we have to quit the game and give up and stop playing ourselves and rely on somebody else's claim about the best move. The presence of several right answers which is entirely possible, doesn't mean that we should forfeit the game because we can't identify which one is best. And additionally, the fact that someone keeps pointing to a losing move and calling it a winning move doesn't change the facts about reality. There is a naturally evolving process in secular moral systems. From very simple beginnings, we're able to construct a complex, robust system that deals with the dynamic nature of the universe we live in. And we don't need anything more than, we'll just pick three. Life is generally preferable to death. We'll just assert that arbitrarily as a de facto axiomatic value right from the get-go. Life is generally preferable to death. Pleasure is generally preferable to pain. And benefit is generally preferable to harm. You're done. Now, those three are going to come in conflict with each other. Let's say those are the three foundational principles that we're going to build a moral system on. This is if there's anything, if you don't get anything else out of it, get this. You've got those three. They can come in conflict with each other. It may be the case that death is preferable to life if your health and well-being is so bad that continuing to exist is not as beneficial to you as the prospect of ending the torment, the whole death with dignity project that many of us support. May be the case. Let's say, though, that we found out that one of those three foundational positions was wrong. We can change it. And people, and I'll get to it in a couple minutes about why this primacy of well-being. I'll talk about that near the end. But the value of a secular moral system is not only that you build from very simple truths, because first of all, life is generally preferable to death. Most of the people who don't agree with that have killed themselves and died off, and so they're not here to argue with us about it. So we're talking about a system where this is already the de facto standard. We would like to continue living. If we're not talking about that, then I have no idea what we're talking about. But the ability to change even those primary values is in there. It's unlikely. I think it's unlikely that we're going to find that death is generally preferable to life. But it's not impossible. And you build secondary and tertiary values on top of those. That's how you construct this web of a secular moral system. And I would argue that that is exactly what everyone throughout history has done. Every civilization, every culture, every religion, every individual. It's just that instead of each individual doing it and thinking these things through on their own, somebody said, this is the way it's going to be. And they may give credit to a god or somebody wiser than them or whatever else. But somebody said, this is the way it's going to be. And then when they didn't have an answer to a specific question, they worked it out. I think if you talk to a bunch of rabbis, you'll find out that that's mostly what the Jewish culture did. When they found the original scriptures lacking, they started defining all these other things. Well, we've got these, we need to make it consistent with that, we can move forward. As our understanding increases, we build a pool of situations to consider. We live our life primarily by inference and induction. Yesterday is pretty much the same as today. No, today is pretty much the same as yesterday. There you go. And because of that, a lot of the evaluations we do are very simple. Hey, is this wrong? Well, it's almost identical to this other situation, and I already know that's wrong, so I'll go ahead and say this is wrong. And the work's done for us. And it's only when we come across a truly unique or some extraordinary circumstances that we run into any difficulty. And the fact is that whether you're building a secular moral system or a religious one, you're still going to reach that point. And apart from one individual declaring to have divine revelation about what the solution is, everybody's doing it the same way. One grand advantage of secular moral systems is that all the old rules can be updated with new rules. I'm not advocating today specific moral positions. Maybe not even those three foundational ones, but I think I'm pretty good with those. I'm talking about the system itself that determines our values and assesses actions. It's the secular method that is demonstrably superior, not necessarily a particular secular set of positions. Because there are plenty of secular individuals who have had a set of positions that were horrible. Stalin. we can build on what we've learned. I don't see that non-secular systems can really build on what they've learned without using the methods that we use. And I'm getting close to kind of the end of this. Outliers can be safely disregarded in most circumstances. And there are people who are going to go, oh, what? And I'm not talking about all of it. But for example, we're not closed-minded if we don't pay any attention to the KKK's position on human rights. It's because we've already considered it. We don't need to keep reconsidering the same thing over and over again. If they have come up with new arguments or they come up with new evidence, then by all means consider it again. But we can't get mired in continuing to reevaluate situations that we've already resolved unless there's something new to address. And I guess that's probably it for that one. So what kind of world do we want to live in? Most people object to the government making and imposing laws on you about what you can do in the privacy of your own home. And yet that's the same sort of externally imposed system that non-secular moral systems try to do. What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world that values freedom, societal health, physical, mental, and emotional? Do we want to live in a society that encourages opportunity, fair competition, and open exchange of ideas? Do we want to live in a society that prospers without doing so at the expense of its citizens? Does it matter what kind of world we want to live in? Or does it only matter what kind of world we're actually in? I mean, you might want a particular position to become the de facto standard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. Do we prefer a democracy to a dictatorship? What sort of limits should we impose when it comes to imposing our moral views onto others? Sam Harris told a story of talking to someone about female genital mutilation. And this is an educated philosophy professor, I believe, who basically said, oh, that's their culture. So you can't say it's wrong. Yes, you can. Not only can you say it, you can be right in saying it. Do you want to live in a world like that? No. And that's one of the things that we can change. That's one of the rules of the game that we can change, is attempting to convince people that our position is more correct. There are a lot of complex questions that we need to address as our planet moves towards a single community, and we do ourselves and future generations a great disservice if we jump into those issues with an inferior system for evaluating them. And we do a greater disservice by denying that this trend is occurring, clinging to treasured traditions from the past. So there's the comparative summary, which is obvious, so obvious I didn't really need a slide. And then there's the comparison. This is, by the way, this is propaganda here. This is not actually an honest argument when I go to that. But it's true. This is what people are seemingly encouraged to accept. So we have the tools we need. We should continue to use them. A secular moral system is one that is free from appeals to external authority. It's robust, inclusive. It's a powerful tool. I'm convinced that everybody's actually used it, whether they think so or not. And earlier I said that anyone would and should agree that secular moral systems are superior. And in fact, I'd argue that they already do. Individuals who ostensibly reject secular morality in favor of one of the many traditional non-secular varieties implicitly recognize and acknowledge that the secular system is superior. And you can tell this by their actions and comparing their current actual values with the traditional values of the system that they're advocating. They don't support slavery, even though their book does. They are moving towards equality, even though their book is opposed to it. They are able to make moral evaluations of situations that are not in any way written in that book. They have opinions on stem cell research. Nowhere in the Bible does it talk about stem cell research at all. They use the tools of reason and evidence generally in every other area, which means they're engaged in special pleading when they carve out an exclusive area for their deity to avoid using reason and evidence. They have, in a very real sense, adopted these secular moral systems as a new external source for their modified reality, their modified morality. Oh, we need an external source, and ours is God, but these other people seem to have a better idea, so we're going to adopt it, but we're going to give credit to God. And so now they're giving one external source credit for something that came from another external source. We need to show people that they don't have to be stealth secularists. They can actually join in and participate. And it's incredibly satisfying to actually do so. It's hard work to think through some of these things, but they can be proud of their participation and directly benefit from their contributions rather than standing in opposition to the very values that they secretly embrace. Secular moral systems are inclusive. The authority comes within. The better answer to that question is of why secular morality is superior is because we say so. And where because I say so is an unsatisfying answer, because we say so is incredibly satisfying. Because you're now a part of it. It's not being imposed on you. We don't need to make appeals to the unknown. We need not, indeed we should not, opt for the lazy, unthinking path. We cannot afford to struggle against progress in order to embrace antiquated ideas. We are intelligent, empathetic, compassionate beings, and we have the ability to set goals and solve problems. We've been doing it for as long as we've had the capacity for thought, and we continue to get better at it. The fact that we're not yet perfect at it doesn't cripple us. Doesn't mean that we're stuck. Doesn't mean that we need to appeal to some external authority as a replacement or a placeholder until we get it sorted out. There should be no question that secular systems methods are superior. And it's time we stop allowing ourselves to get mired in fallacious appeals to ignorance and authority and simply continue to build a better world. That slide used to be the end. Then, like many other things, I found out that I was wrong. By the way, that's a great thing. The best thing about finding out you're wrong is that you don't have to keep being wrong, which is what the secular moral systems have already discovered. We don't have to keep being wrong. So it's not because we say so, because that sounds too much like moral relativism, that whatever we deem is morally correct is. The correct answer is because it appeals to reason and evidence about reality. Or at least that's my current correct answer. I might be wrong again. We are physical beings in a physical reality. What I do has consequences for myself and everybody else. We're stuck sharing space. If there was only one thinking being left in the universe, it may be the case that there could no longer be any such thing as morality. Because we're talking about well-being and we're talking about the interactions of people. I'm pretty much convinced that you need to have an interaction. There needs to be some level of responsibility to each other, and that's how we distinguish between moral duties and obligations and moral virtues. If there's a child standing out in the middle of the road, you probably don't have a moral obligation to put your life at risk to save it. That may be considered a moral virtue. It depends on whether or not you have, you're in a custodialship and you've agreed to do that sort of thing. And so there's the distinction. Both are good moral actions, but one is a duty and the other one is a virtue. Learning to recognize the difference in those is what we're actually trying to do. It's not only finding out what's right, but the different types of right as well. And so I added one last slide, which is blank. Apart from the stuff at the top, but it is not blank. Because everybody keeps saying, oh, Sam Harris got this all wrong. You guys are just, this is simple consequentialism. This has already been debunked. The philosophers have already determined that you can't, how do you solve the Azoth problem, blah, 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 blah. So why well-being? Why do we care about well-being? Why should we care about well-being? Or should we at all? Why do I get to define morality as specifically relating to well-being? I have come so that you might have life and have it more abundantly. That's Jesus, but I'm going to steal it. It's the goal. I'm not claiming to have solved the Azoth problem. I'm just not convinced that it matters. We care about things. That's who we are, whether we like it or not. We can have a whole other conversation about whether we have free will or not, about whether you actually make any choices. Certainly, I'll quickly say you don't choose any of your beliefs, your preferences? When did you choose to start liking strawberry ice cream over vanilla? Was that a conscious decision that you made? When did you choose to be straight? But the people who don't care about these things, as I mentioned before, have likely removed themselves from the population at worst. But at best, they remove themselves from the discussion. Those people who prefer death over life, etc. I'm talking about well-being and equating it with morality because I'm convinced personally that morality doesn't make any sense under any other context. And most of the critics seem to agree, as their objections tend to water the concept down to where it can mean anything. Well-being is, in my estimation, that thing that gives the term morality substance. And they're watering it down so that it can mean anything. And yet those same critics do seem to care about well-being. So if you're stuck on the is-ought problem, and if you're stuck on why do we get to say that morality is about well-being, ignore the term morality entirely. Change every instance of it in this entire talk to well-being, because that's the concept that I'm talking about. And we shouldn't let the label get in the way of the concept. Now, if somebody has some other view of morality, I don't know what it is, and I don't necessarily understand it, and maybe they don't either. But I'm not aware of any instance of people making proclamations and evaluations that they do label morality, where they're not, in actual fact, talking about well-being. If you say something's wrong, any example of that where you make a moral declaration seems to be tied back to well-being. There may be exceptions that I'm not aware of yet. But if we find out that there's a better foundation than well-being, secular moral systems are the ones that can actually change that as well. And in non-secular systems, you are stuck. And one last change. Secular moral systems are superior because they're the only moral systems that exist, which I've already mentioned, but it was written here at the end. I knew it was important, I didn't want to forget it. Religious moral systems aren't systems, they're pronouncements and edicts. They don't provide instruction on how to evaluate situations outside of the explicit list they provide, which is why we have countless disagreements about what Jesus thinks about something. It's bad enough that we have disagreements over his view on topics he never mentioned. We also have disagreements about things that he did mention, if he in fact mentioned anything at all. That's not a system. It's not even particularly helpful. It is, and I don't say this to necessarily be insulting, although I've probably insulted religion several times tonight anyways, it's too late to stop. It's a pacifier. We have evolved to be lazy thinkers. The types of things that developed our brain and our thought processes were essential. And now we've got way too much spare time on our hands. And we're in a much, much, much more complicated world. We can get by really well with inference and induction. Hey, yeah, these situations are similar, let's go. But when it goes wrong, it can go wrong spectacularly. And that's why we have to actually take the extra steps of thinking critically, thinking skeptically, and applying deductive reasoning whenever we can. Because of this, we are from birth reliant on our parents and authorities. And the easiest thing to do is to keep relying on those authorities. Why is this wrong? Oh, because God said so. Cool, done. That settles it. If God said it and I believe it, that settles it for me, although that was changed to God said it and that settles it for me because it's true whether you believe it or not. But this bad habit we have of saying somebody else will figure this out for me works. It works a lot. We have constructed a society that allows us to be just about as lazy as possible when it comes to doing the hard work, to basically leech off other people's ideas. That's not entirely wrong, and it may be a great survival tactic. But it's so much more empowering to actually get in and participate, to actually sit down and do the hard thinking of, when I gave up my Christianity and moved on, I had to reevaluate almost everything I believed. What's my position on abortion? What's my position on the death penalty? What's my position on taxes? You know, anything that might have come from my religion, I have to sit down and evaluate. A lot of people, I think, stay in for fear of having to do exactly that. They've got a pat answer. The problem is, that answer is not necessarily right. They don't have any good reason to think that it's likely to become right. And that is why secular moral systems are superior. Thanks. I'll take questions on pretty much anything. And I apologize because, like I said, it's been 4 years since I gave this talk, so I was actually rethinking things as I was giving it, because that's what I do. I'm overly critical. And if nothing else, I'll go to the bar and do magic tricks or something.
I'm neither here.
Well, those are the only two options.
We're not here.
Oh, okay.
Check.
Hey.
Check.
Want to make a line for questions here? Give me a microphone.
Can you tell him that microphone?
That's right.
Gannon, the microphone is very fuzzy. The sounds,
It's fuzzy.
yeah, it's not fantastic.
It's always awesome when somebody who took notes is the first one to ask a question.
Yeah, before I pose my question, just maybe you could review for me your three foundational positions. Your first was life was to be preferred to death, and then you got into well-being.
Life is generally preferable to death. They're all general type.
Right, and then the second was
Pleasure is generally preferable to pain.
pleasure to pain. Okay.
Benefit is generally preferable to harm.
Pleasure,
Now,
pleasure to pain and benefit to
to harm.
To harm.
And the problem is that while life and death are somewhat well defined, benefit and harm may be fuzzier,
Okay.
because that's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay.
And so the goal, if the goal is to determine what is in fact beneficial to us,
Okay.
there are some things that we can assess and perhaps even quantify, and there are other things that we can't. So nothing about this idea of having a secular moral system or any moral system means that we're saying we will actually discover the correct moral position on X, right? Because we might be stuck. There may be things that we just can't evaluate.
Okay. I seem to come away from this with your non-committal to any kind of a position with regard to morality. Now, I could be wrong with that, okay, because yours is an ever-changing world, apparently, okay? That's the feeling that I get, okay? Any position today might be changed tomorrow, okay? Now if that's incorrect, then I've misunderstood.
Yeah, so
position, okay?
I avoided talking about specific moral positions on purpose, because but I'll tell you this. It's certainly likely that positions can change, but I'm going to go on a limb and say that I view morality situational.
Right.
If there was a situation where something I considered to be immoral became moral in that situation, I'd acknowledge it. But that doesn't mean that particular situation is possible. So here's where I'll go on a limb with like an example. My position is that it is morally wrong to own another human being as property. That there is no situation that could possibly happen within the reality we inhabit that would make that moral.
And I understand. So there are certain positions that you take that are inalterable, let's say. Unless proven otherwise. Unless somebody comes with their argument that
until somebody comes with a
change their
situation.
mind. Okay, I understand that. Okay. Your quote was, we care about things because that's who we are. That was a direct quote. Yeah. Okay. My question is, and why are we that way?
Yeah.
Okay. And point being, a lion never considers whether or not it's right or wrong to kill someone, but we do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I guess my question becomes, what, in your opinion, makes man unique?
I don't know.
Because it seems to me that you're suggesting by that, meaning that a lion never considers whether or not it's right or wrong to kill something.
I don't know.
But we do, okay? So it seems to me to be suggesting that we're unique. And my question to you is, do you consider that we're unique or not?
So the why question is one that I don't even know is, why is blue? I don't even know that it's something that has an answer. This idea that we are unique.
Yeah, that's my question. Do you consider that every unique?
I think that everything is unique. I don't.
Well,
when it comes to morality,
unique in the sense that we even need to have this discussion about morality. I mean, the Lions are not having this discussion about,
are they? I don't
morality.
know. I don't know what
We are.
I don't know what a lion thinks. I don't know if it considers the consequences of its actions or how much it considers the consequences. And I don't know that it is forever stuck not doing that. My evaluation of morality is that it is about the interactions of thinking beings.
Right.
And as far as I know, humans are the only life on Earth that has this self-reflective capability to assess their actions. We may be the only ones currently who are capable of considering these issues.
See, that's where I would agree with you. Oh, okay, that's where I would agree. We have intellect and will, which in a sense separates us from other constituents. And why do we have this discussion about morality?
Yeah,
Yes,
and actually, when I said that we care about things, one of the things we care about is this. And we may never know why we care about it. I don't know. I don't even know that question is answerable, but thanks.
Well, it's just,
Let me hang on to that for 1 second, because there's an aspect I didn't touch on. And that is that when we talk about morality in the sense of interactions with thinking beings, I talked a little bit about the difference between moral virtues and moral obligations. There's also this idea about moral responsibility, and it's usually, my position is that your moral responsibility is proportional to your ability to comprehend this. And so, for example, those who are outside of Texas, we don't tend to execute people who have mental issues, who are low IQ and can't, or have other mental issues that prevent them from understanding the consequences of their actions. Texas will do that. We get on the death penalty thing some other time. But we hold children to a different standard than we hold adults because they can't yet comprehend these things. And so when it comes to other species, I view them as moral and responsible, directly proportional to their ability to comprehend it. And so I don't say that the shark is immoral for trying to eat me. And I'm not sure that I could say I was immoral for trying to eat the shark, because there is an inequitable relationship there, although the ethical vegans would disagree with me, and we can have that conversation another time. But that's the thing about moral responsibility. And we are speciesist about it. And so we know that because you are human, even if you don't personally have the ability to evaluate this, your species does, and so you're judged by that standard. And that may actually be wrong. We may need to change the way we think about imprisonment, penalties, perhaps avoiding this idea of retribution or punishment, and focus more on safeguarding people and rehabilitation if possible. But the neuroscientists are going to do a lot more in that area than some yahoo like me talking about moral philosophy stuff. Anyway, good.
I'm sorry, just a quick announcement. We're going to have free pizza after this event.
Oh, let's go.
So just stick around for that.
Okay, so what I got from the talk was that there is the question of which world state are we aiming towards? What is the goal we're aiming towards? And then there was also the debate over what the best way to get there is for that. I think there was a third aspect that didn't really get touched on much, and that was what sort of ideas prompt someone to go out of their way to shift the world toward that desirable world state? Which sorts of ideas are better at motivating action towards making the world better?
Yes, that wasn't addressed because I don't currently have a solution for fixing the world, but I am working on it.
Oh,
I think, no, that was a little glib. I like the question because I think it's important. Because there is an aspect of this it's not just which actions should we take to make the world better, but also what ideas should we encourage to make people more willing and desirable of changing the world that way. And that is a question where I would imagine I could have a really good talk with a pastor friend of mine in Austin, because one of the positions from some religions is that even if their particular doctrines don't immediately obviously lead to a better world, the encouragement of those doctrines encourage that in people. And my response to them is that they're wrong. Because every study we've ever done shows that religiosity is no indicator of whether or not someone is more moral, or whether, so those ideas haven't actually encouraged people to be more moral.
Yes, a funny other anecdote about that is that even among moral philosophers, they did a study on whether moral philosophers are more likely to behave morally than the rest of us, how much they donate to charity, how often they keep books overdue from the library, and they found out that it didn't seem to have much of an effect on them either. So I think it's a really important question to figure out just what does motivate someone to make a serious effort toward making the world better.
It may be that we are a species who does nothing but rationalize, and that even after we discovered, I mentioned something today. So I lost my job back in January, and there was a period around July or August where I was kind of depressed, it's pretty severely for a while. Everything's fine now. I got a Patreon project. You don't have to donate to it, but you can if you want to. But the videos are free to everybody, and so life's much better now. But during this time, I would say, oh, I'm depressed. I'm smart enough to recognize that I'm depressed, therefore I have a handle on it. And then when I realized that that didn't give me a handle on it, I then said, I'm smart enough to recognize that thinking that I had a handle on it did not guarantee that I had a handle on it, but now that I recognize that, I have a handle on it. It's a lie. It's the sort of lie that we're really good at telling ourselves. And it may be the case that the people who have the best understanding of moral systems could turn out to be the ones who are most adept at exploiting them and making use of other people. But those aren't answers that we have yet. Or I don't have them. But that'd be kind of scary. All right, great.
One thing that I noticed that you did during your talk is that you made the point that in establishing moral truth, and I believe you, correct me if I'm wrong, you did make the point that we can achieve objective moral truth, correct?
We seem to think we can, and it seems likely that we can.
Okay, and so you appeal to natural law or to observations, and in terms of how we reach those moral truths.
Mm-hmm.
You offered a couple of statements. Life is more preferable than death, etc. Right. And I would agree. And
that's good, because the people who don't agree, I worry about.
For good reason. My question is this, and you seem to actually backpedal or address this at the end, and you made the point that you haven't figured this out yet, which is, I appreciate that, but while that may, I can see where that may give you moral reasons or moral standards. I guess my question is, on what basis can you then bind your observations and your moral standards on someone else? In other words, you can say that life is more preferable than death, but then the next question is, why should I care? Now I do care, don't get me wrong, yeah. But that's the next question, is why should I care? Why should this person care? How can you make them care? What if you can't make them care? What gives you the right to judge that person who may come to a different conclusion than you?
This isn't necessarily about judging people. And by the way, I get asked a lot, what do you think of so-and-so? What do you think of so-and-so? I don't tend to endorse people. I endorse ideas and actions. And that's kind of what we're talking about. If there's someone who does not have well-being as a foundation for their motivations, I'd like to know what it is and why. Because like I said, I think even the people who deny it seem to come down to that. I can't make somebody care about something. all I can do is say that I disagree with them, try to convince them, and usually it's not that hard. It's not very difficult to get people to agree that life is generally preferable to death. And the people who tend to disagree tend to be in situations where they have good reasons to maybe not think that that's true. That I guess is the advantage that I was trying to show, is that none of these are easy questions. None of them are things that we have solved. But one method has some hope of solving them and resolving them in accordance with the facts about reality. I use the extreme examples, like, someone's stabbing you if you're warm, fuzzy, and improves your life, just to kind of make it obvious. There's a lot of things that are at these extremes that I think we've already solved, or I think we're in the process of solving. That, there is this idea, it's called the veil of ignorance, and that is, design the system that you're going to live in without knowing what your positions are going to be when you come in. And when that gets to the heart of what we tend to think is fair, almost nobody is going to design a system. It's like, an easier example of this is if you're cutting a cake. If there's 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, 8 people, doesn't matter. You have one person cut the cake knowing that they get last choice of the pieces. And all of a sudden the cake gets divided pretty evenly. Unless you pick a diabetic like me, and then I'm not happy, so I don't have an interest in it. But generally speaking, we all have some interest in life, this cake that we're sharing. So while there's no easy solution to them, I don't see any hope of a solution using the externally imposed religious pronouncements. They seem to be more akin to keeping people in line than actually improving things.
I've got a few other questions that make it to the back of the line if I'm allowed to do that. But
Sure.
So I don't want to argue with you here, but just the follow-up question would be that if someone doesn't agree with your method of establishing morality,
Mhm.
do you, the society, have the right to coerce them into falling in line? And if so, what's the difference between your method and the method of
Yeah. And the answer to that is, I think that there are plenty of situations where we not only do we have the right, but we have an obligation in defense of others. A lot of this comes down to individual autonomy and individual freedom. And so if you're doing something and you've managed to get to the point where it only affects you, which is virtually impossible, but you can get close, then we probably don't have much impetus to move. We don't have much justification. But if there's an FLDS group that is marrying off and raping their 9-year-olds, I think we have an obligation to intervene on their behalf, irrespective of what their religion has to say about it, irrespective of what the group feels. But I'm not advocating that we go marching with guns, slaughtering people. There's hopefully a much more peaceful resolution to this. But there are some people, for whatever reason, who will opt for situations and scenarios that are incredibly harmful to them. And one of my big pushes is, or 2 of them, doing what we can to end indoctrination. Because a lot of these things start when you get the little kid and you raise them on these ideas and that's all they know. But the other one is destigmatizing mental illness, because a lot of people don't get the treatment that they need that keeps them locked in these counterproductive things. And so the goal is to help people in a productive and positive fashion rather than marching in and killing them. Although there may be situations where that's the only way, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question about my experience with my creationist friends. I try to convince them that God doesn't exist because we have common morals across the world. That people in cultures that never even heard about the name Yahweh, that they tend to act in a way that is treat others in the way you wish others to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
And what argument I get from them is they told me the book of Romans.
Yeah, God, in Romans 1, God has written his moral code essentially. in everybody's heart so they're without excuse.
Yeah, my question is just how do you, based on your experience, how do you react to when Christians, they say that God made non-Christians have morals because He, God made them that way to be moral, even if they are unconscious of God.
Yep. So one of the things he's referencing a passage in Romans that not even evangelicals used to say that basically all of us on the planet are moral because we intuitively know what God expects of us. And there's a number of problems with that. Number one, clearly we don't all have the same views about morality. While we have some senses of morality throughout the world, they're not the same. We're constantly fighting over them. Number two is there's a gross logical problem with their claim. And that is kind of summarized in the Euthyphro dilemma, which is something moral because God says so, or does God say so because it's moral? So if God wrote his moral code on your heart, what difference does that make? If I wrote my moral code on your heart, you would then be judging me by my own standards. Everybody's going to pass that test. If Satan wrote his moral code on your heart, Satan's going to pass with flying colors because he's now being judged by his own standards. It does not resolve the problem at all to say that God's standards, that God is good by God's standards. And it also doesn't demonstrate at all that God's standards are in fact good. This idea of divine command theory, that something is moral merely because God says so, means that God could change his mind tomorrow and say that it's now moral to slaughter innocent children, which evidently he's done at some point or another. But that doesn't make it so. What it's done is it's removed morality from the discussion in any meaningful sense. And all you then have is a list of things that you are then going to be in compliance with. And that's what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, where there's no guarantee that any of those are in our best interest, any of those do anything positive for our well-being. So telling me that God wrote his moral code on my heart is pretty useless, especially when I disagree with it. Like, I've debated abortion on a couple different occasions against both atheists and theists. Now, if God wrote his moral code on all of us, then we should agree on the moral evaluations, and yet we don't. So their claim is pretty much a non-starter, and if nothing else fails, then prove it. Prove that God gave me some moral guidance or instruction. Prove that I have some sensus divinatus or inner witness of the Holy Spirit that is in fact my conscience. Because from all I can tell, they seem to be co-opting what we do naturally and giving that credit to their God.
So I have two questions. The second one's going to be influenced by the first.
Okay.
In your opinion, is morality a subjective label that humans place on a concept, or does it exist outside of human reality?
The first.
Okay, in that case, why can we not say that moral relativism exists? Other people label something as moral, which we do not. We disagree with them. Say, in reality, this is why we disagree and why we want to move on to our current moral opinions as opposed to yours.
You could do that. The thing is that while morality is a label for our concepts, the concept is about well-being. And that is tied to actual facts about reality. So the reason I answered your first question that it was the label of the concept is partly because of the way it's phrased. But my position is that there are moral truths or well-being truths, if you prefer, to be discovered about interactions. That these are the result of a physical reality, that while we can have subjective views about them, they are not themselves the product of any mind. I mean, that's why I use this dad example. I don't know why I keep going to violence. I can maybe go to something else. If I eat sugar, it's bad for me. That's not necessarily true for everybody. Actually, it probably is true for everybody, but it's worse for me. And sometimes I don't care. But distilling down to what the actual facts of reality are is how we can go ahead and say, and this, I guess I didn't hit hard enough because I don't even think I mentioned it until I got the questions. What I'm advocating for is situational moral evaluations. And some situations are so similar that we can leverage them. But every situation ultimately needs to be viewed independently. And so while we can have disagreements about what we think is the right answer, there is, here we go, best explanation I've got. For any situation, there is a finite set of actions that you can take. Agreed? Okay. They do not all produce the same results. You can take actions that are more beneficial, less beneficial, harmful, whatever. We can compare the consequences of those actions with each other, and we can put them on a ladder from worst to best, theoretically, hypothetically, sorry. That means that there must be some set of one or more actions, because some of them could turn out to be equivalent, that represent the moral pinnacle for that situation, the best possible action. And it is not in any way impacted by anybody's opinion.
I think the counter to that would just be that people might measure the consequences differently.
Yes.
But I'd probably take it no.
No, and the other counter to that is that so what are the consequences to me versus what are the consequences to others versus what are the consequences to society? There's this web that we have to, and this is why morality is not necessarily an easy topic, because we don't always know. But one thing we do know, or I think we know, is that we are incredibly myopic. We are really bad at things that are far removed from us geographically and temporally. And we are really bad at seeing the long-term consequences of our actions and good at seeing the short-term. We are really bad at seeing the consequences of our actions on others and good at seeing the benefit to us. And so recognizing that something that you may initially view as the right action because it gets this immediate benefit to you, that you could be wrong because there's another action that gets you a better benefit longer term because it benefited everybody. That's kind of the progress we're making. And I don't have answers.
Thank you.
I wish. It'd make all this a lot easier.
All right. My question is, what moral view did you have prior to your deconversion, which was most difficult to reconcile after?
What moral view did... So there were a lot of things that I changed my mind on, and there were some things I didn't. And it kind of worked out interestingly because my parents recognize that I'm still a good person, even though I'm working for Satan and leading people to hell. This has been really difficult for them. It's very difficult to vilify somebody if you know them to be a good person. It's difficult to label all atheists as the Bible does, as none of us can do any good if you know atheists who are doing good things. As far as which one was most difficult, I think capital punishment is the one that I have spent the most time on because, and I can change my mind, but I don't necessarily have a problem with the concept that there are some people who, by virtue of their actions and their inability to be rehabilitated, that the best thing we can do for all of them, is to kill them. And yet I am strongly opposed to the death penalty now. Primarily because I don't think we have a system that can guarantee me this, that we're necessarily doing the right thing to the right person. And I don't know that such a system is ever possible. So even though I might not be idealistically opposed to it, I am practically opposed to it. And it's one that I've gone all around on over and over again. So a lot of the rest of them were pretty easy. And most of them didn't change. I'm not in favor of killing people in general. That was pretty easy.
That's very interesting. I have a question regarding systems of secularism morality, and what's one that you would endorse that if I want to be more about and understand? Where would I start with that? And then secondly, in your own experience, how do you determine between which one to choose?
Yeah. So when it comes to secular moral systems, I don't know that I can give you a label for a particular formal system. I think we are in the process of recognizing that we're starting to formalize some of these things. The closest I get is probably the Secular Humanist Manifesto. It seems to be a good foundation to build off of. I don't know, so what Sam Harris is advocating and what I'm pretty much advocating is a sort of pragmatic consequentialism that's based on scientific evaluation of reality, but it doesn't exist as some structured system. It may be the case that we never get to a, you know, I am a secular moralist ABB3, you know, that we get that kind of label on it. But as far as general starting points, in addition to the three that I kind of talked about, I'm pretty good with the Secular Humanist Manifesto. There may be some subtleties that, you know, they revise it from time to time. Get that. The Secular Humanist Manifesto doesn't read today as it did when it was, you know, originally put together. And that's because it includes the goal of getting better at getting better. But I can't give you like a, oh, go do this one or look this one up. That's about as close as I get. And there was a second part of that? Yeah, it's all results driven. It is. So one of the things is that it could be the case, whether there's a God or not, that living under a particular religion actually benefits us tremendously and could actually be the best moral system. You could put together this list and it's part of this religion. It could be the case. But this is about the method of determining whether it's not the case, which is what are the actual results? We are not yet at the point where we can really quantify all the results. All we can do is take a look at what people have claimed about their systems and see if that's the results you get. For example, there's a lot of people who cite that atheists are underrepresented, grossly underrepresented in the prison population. I don't think any of those statistics are very good. I think one of the things is, given the society we built, if you want hope of parole, you're probably going to say that you're part of a religion, even if you're not. So you're not going to find that many people saying, yep, I'm a godless heathen. Want to give me parole? Because there's already a bias against that. There's other things because it's self-reported and sample sizes. But it turns out that under the best studies, we are underrepresented. But I don't think you need to go to that. When I first started talking about this with some relatives who are religious, I brought up the fact that I'm pretty sure that it's not just atheists who are keeping rock music, the porn industry, the prostitution industry, they pick whatever that they think is immoral. We're not the only ones keeping it in business, which means that their moral systems aren't doing anything profound to make them less likely to participate. And the answer, of course, I get is the no true Christian fallacy, no true Scotsman fallacy, which is, oh, the Christians who are, you know, watching porn are not real Christians. So they exclude anybody who doesn't fit. And it's kind of like the same thing that AA does. They have pretty much no data on their recidivist rate, because if you ever go back to drinking, then you didn't work the program. So we have a real problem with data collection. And this is, I guess, probably what Sam and I, to a lesser extent, have been advocating for, is let's make people aware of this stuff so that we can start doing better studies to figure out how to go about it. Because we're not there yet. But I think we at least know enough to know what to avoid in some cases, like religion. But yeah, that's me.
Hi, Matt. I watch Atheist Experience all the time, so much that I feel like I hate your voice.
Oh, good.
And I just had a question about atheists in general, being atheists, especially in American society. I've seen, since 2011, I've seen, 2001, 9/11.
Sure.
I've seen huge resurgence in Christianity. From what I saw in the 90s, it seemed like kind of lessened, and now it seems to be really booming. And I wanted to ask you if you think that to atheists, would they have a lot of hope? Because I feel like we're demonized. Like, I'm demonized in my own family. I can't even bring it up to my grandma. She's strict Catholic. Everyone else in my family knows it, but I don't bring it up around my grandma. She's send my dad to Catholic school, he absolutely hated it. So we're not.
So the trends, I don't know, religion kind of does this thing here, but the trend is a reduction. So the fastest growing religious demographic is Islam. And the fastest growing religious identity or identity about religion are the nuns, the NONEs, those of us who don't have a religion. And Arnold in his latest talk kind of said that it's starting to look like in the United States that there's a race between atheism and Islam to see which one's going to take over when Christianity dies out. Now, I think he's a little optimistic, but he's not necessarily wrong. I think that the trend is toward improvement. I also think even if the trend weren't currently that way, that reality is going to win out in the end. So if it turns out there's a God, cool, I'd like to know. But, you know, it doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be consistent. One of the things that we're doing, there's more than one atheist community. There's communities that participate in secular student alliances and groups and activism. And then there's like an online community, and there's some overlap, and they do different things. But one of the things that we're starting to do is build more communities. Because if you look at like the Recovering from Religion group and the Clergy Project, and these people who, not everybody who finds their way out of religion is just, oh, great, I'm done now, I get to go, you know, live life and do stuff. Some people are traumatized, and I've known people who were atheists for 50 years who still wake up with nightmares at night of hell, you know, that they were indoctrinated with as a kid. And some, you know, we're social creatures, and so building these communities is what's going to help. But the biggest thing, not everybody can be out yet. You can't be out to your grandmother. There are people who can't be out to anybody for fear of losing their job. That's happened over and over again. Fear of being disowned, of losing their entire social structure, all their friends. You know, it's difficult. And so building these communities provide them kind of safe landing spots. And then the more people who are out, the easier all this becomes. Because while there are plenty of people who absolutely hate me, and I don't get a ton of hate mail, but I get some. And, well, that's a topic for another time. Not all of them do. And the more people they know, you know, I heard a story about some people who showed up at an atheist convention only to meet their neighbor that was on the backside of the fence from them, who they'd known for 15, 20 years. Neither of them had any idea that they were atheists. They were both atheists the whole time, and they interacted. It wasn't like, you know, this is the neighbor I don't talk to. It's, holy crap, what are you doing here? Ah, yeah, that. We have to do a better job of building a world where people can be out. And we're doing it. I mean, I think we're seeing that. So I'm incredibly optimistic about the future and everything else. And while it's, there are people that I can't talk to about this in my family as well. And my wife's family is far worse than mine. And so while I empathize the issue with your grandmother, don't take my word for it. Go look it up, because I think there's incredible cause for optimism. And there are people who are doing good work to make that a reality. So, thanks. I didn't know how to laser point. So, that's my email address, obviously. But this is the website for the new project, the Patreon. It's about teaching people how to debate better. And I'm going to, after we're done filming, I'll issue, we're done with the questions and filming, I'll issue an apology and a clarification. But go ahead.
Yeah, this kind of goes along with what you were just saying. But I was wondering, well, I know being in church and being in that community, it can be a, you know, you can get a big sense of community from that. And I was wondering if you ever experienced any shame or guilt when you left the church, and what you did to overcome it.
Not me personally. And I get this question in other forms too, of like, you know, did you still have lingering fears of whatever? No. By the time I got around to actually acknowledging that I was an atheist, man, life was just awesome. There were struggles with family members, but it's not that way for everybody. There are groups out there, and there's actually a secular therapy project, and Dr. Marlene Winnell has been working with Religious Trauma Center for people, specifically people coming from very fundamentalist, very cult-like backgrounds, where they have been othered, or they have been disowned. I was lucky in that my parents are just generally awesome. They had a hard time with it at the beginning. And the hardest part for me was watching them have a hard time with it. I didn't feel regret. Our church youth group was incredibly tight. There's actually a Facebook page. I'm 45, so this is 30 plus years ago, or around that. There's a Facebook page for the kids that were there in my years. My brother actually set it up, and they all joined. And then I joined, and then that Facebook page died. Nobody wanted to, well, there were a couple people who talked to me, but mostly nobody wanted to talk to me. And my takeaway from that, I was actually okay with it. I mean, there's an element of sadness in there, but I want people in my life who appreciate me for me, and I need to be me. And to their credit, there are a great many of them that are still friends with me. There's a lot that aren't. And as sad as it is, I think my life is better off without them at the current point. Hopefully, things can change where it doesn't need to be this big of a conflict, but it can take a bit.
Thank you. Thanks.
I know we're running out of time. I've got a flurry of questions, and then I'll sit down. So bear with me. You made the comparison earlier in your speech to the deity-human relationship and the parent-child relationship, and you said that the difference is I'm not a child.
Yeah.
And obviously you're not a child, or you're a really big child if you are. But the question is, if there is, presuppose with me that there is an omniscient, all-powerful, all-wise God, presumably, then even though you're not a child, there is still a separation between you and him. So I don't know that the comparison is exact. The other question I have, and then I'll shut up, is
I'm the one who do all the talking. Go ahead.
Well, that's why you're here.
Okay.
Which model best predicts the uniqueness of man and the moral nature of man, the creation, the biblical creation model, or the atheistic model, if I can say that? And so those are my questions, and I appreciate you coming.
Sure, thanks. So first of all, on the gap between us and God, not my fault. I mean, if I created something and it didn't give it the ability to understand what I wanted out of it, that's my fault. If I write a piece of software, I mean, we're basically bugged software then. But also, there's no reason to think that that's actually the case. It could, I won't say it could be the case. I can't say that it's not possible that that's the case. But I have no good reason to think that is. And as I've said before, if it turns out there is a God, and the Bible is an accurate representation of his moral character, then I want nothing to do with him because I'm already morally superior to him. And so is everybody else that I've ever met, apart from a couple serial killers, I suppose. You know, there's a bunch of absurdities tied up in that whole thing. And I apologize, what was the second part?
Which model?
Which model? So the theistic model isn't a model. It is not something that makes predictions that are specific and unique to it. It is not falsifiable. And so it doesn't count as a model. Because if there is a God who can do anything, then you can make any prediction along those lines. And when you say, basically this comes down to kind of like a video that I'm actually working on, the second part of the argument from design, which is what are the odds? Is it more likely that humans would gain consciousness, awareness, and the sort of self-reflection required to evaluate these moral positions with or without guidance? And the answer is, we have no reason to think, we have no way of evaluating that, we have no way of quantifying it, because we don't have any other beings or any other models or any other universes to compare it to. So I could also come up with other models that are also falsifiable, which are the rough equivalent of, let's say, the Christian model or the theist model, because they would all be magic something did it. If there were universe-creating pixies who wanted us to do something and created the universe, that would be consistent and a pretty good predictor in the same context as the other of human intelligence. Now, here's a question to kind of flip this backwards. If you happen to think, or somebody happens to think, that this is a falsifiable model and a valid objection, the universe is about 13.7, 13.8 billion years old. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Humans have been on it for a very short period of time, relatively speaking. I guess if somebody's a young Earth creationist, we'd have to have another conversation. What is it about the God model that makes, if the goal is to create human beings with conscious awareness, that requires 13.7 billion years of silence and nothing? And if the answer is that God was waiting around to work with evolution, or work through evolution, great. And we can go back to Laplace and say we had no need of the God hypothesis, which isn't actually an accurate quote, I know, so don't beat me up. But there is no room or reason to think that within the mechanisms of evolution that there's any room for God to move around, or any requirement that such is the case. And we can look at, we're not the only creatures, by the way, that have a sense of morality. There are simpler senses of morality that are based on this idea of fairness, which we can see in other primates, as well as other animals as well. So we're not unique in that sense, we're just better at it. It's like saying, you could say the cheetah is unique because it runs the fastest, but really you're just saying it runs faster, because there are a lot of creatures that think and think at different levels, and some of them have a sense of fairness, which is the first inklings of having a moral code. Because this idea that, hey, this benefits me. You're getting more of a benefit than I am. I want that benefit. That, it's funny that when you look at the Ten Commandments and people try to claim that it's foundational law, when really coveting is what we're based on. I mean, coveting is the model for the United States of America for sure, but in humans in general, it's this idea of, hey, that looks good, I want to get that. And the difference, the thing that makes coveting bad versus good, is how you go about trying to get that. And so my conjecture is that in the early days, people saw this coveting going on, and people taking the easy shortcut, which was stealing people's stuff, or killing them and taking it, whatever else. And so they were coveting bad. And in reality, coveting is good. It's what drives us. And if you come up with better ways to attain it without doing harm to the others, then you have progressed.
I was going to ask how you would modify St. Mary's moral landscape.
That's an awesome last question that I'm not going to answer. And the reason is this: I gave this talk, and as soon as we're done filming, I'll say a couple other things, and then we can leave. I won't talk to you all night about this. I haven't read the book in 5 years. I've only met Sam once, and that was at a book signing. He probably has no idea who I am. Or maybe he does, but I don't. There was only one example, where I had really strong objections to what he said in the book. And I tried to talk to him about this example, and he kind of blew me off. He's there to sign books, not to have a debate. And so I let it go, because by and large, we're kind of in agreement. We're in disagreement about a number of other things, but we're kind of in agreement on this. So I can't say that I know what I would change, or that I have the expertise to do that change. What I would like to see is more people taking a look at that. And I know some people have just dismissed it outright, and some people have written, counters to it and stuff like that. But I think there's something there that we should build off of, whether it's right, whether Sam's view is ultimately right or not. That's as good as I can get you. Sorry.
Okay, well, to prove to everyone the superiority of secular morality, we bought a lot of pizza.
All right. So we're not recording.
And that's upstairs in the grade room, so you guys hopefully will join us. Let's give a round of applause for that.
So I stopped giving this talk for a couple of reasons. One is because Sam's books that came out, and I was like, oh, I'm just repeating stuff. Two is that I'm not in any way an expert in any of this stuff. These were my thoughts, and this is kind of where I was heading. And number three, I don't like the talk, and I don't like the way it's put together. I live and work on a TV show where I live extemporaneously. And when I do debates, apart from the debate with Cy where I had everything pre-written, nothing's pre-written. I can't stand being read to. I don't like reading to people because I can't stand being read to. And this was pretty much a whole bunch of, for me, dry reading. So I appreciate people sitting through it. I hope that you got something out of it, something to spark some thoughts. But I think I'm going to retire this version of the talk entirely as I did 5 years ago, and instead have more of these kinds of discussions about morality, where I can hit the same points in a different way. But one of the projects that I'm working on is that Patreon project, and there's a bunch of videos out there. They are free for everybody. You can watch them at my YouTube channel. You can watch them at the Patreon channel. You do not have to contribute. You're welcome to, but I'm not here advertising that. But I will advertise for the student group. It's the idea of doing more debates, not just because I'd like to come do them. I mean, I guess it's a little self-promotion. But I've seen a lot of changes in the movement over the last few years. And conferences are great, love. But a lot of people come to conferences and they go home and never do anything else afterwards. So my shift is towards instilling more humanist and more activist mentality in people wherever I can. Now that I'm a professional, I lost my job in January, now I'm doing this full time, so it's where I'm going. But debates are great for groups because you don't just fill a room with godless heathens, you get to work with church groups, and whether you realize it or not, whether it seems like it or not, there are allies. There are atheists in pews, there are atheists in the pulpit as we go from clergy project. But setting aside the actual non-believers who still go to church because they're putting up a facade, there are plenty of religious people who agree with us to the extent that we agree on a number of issues. And I'd like to see us kind of do a better job of leveraging some of that whenever we can. And so, having done so many debates over the last 10, 12 years, I put together a project and started off with Pascal's Wager, with the argument from design. It's covering debates that I've done, showing mistakes that I made and mistakes that my opponent made so that we can learn from everybody's mistakes. And then moving forward, I'm not just, we're going to do the Kalam cosmological argument and go through all these formal ones. We're going to do that. But I'm also addressing real world apologetics that you're going to hear when you're talking to your family and friends. And coming up in early October is going to be a complete, thorough breakdown of faith. What it means to who, and what it means when you're in the conversation and you get to the point where, well, you just got to have faith. What does that even mean? So I'll be doing that in October. I really appreciate everybody coming out. I'm looking forward to pizza and miscellaneous stuff, and feel free to ask more questions.
The sales and the pizza is upstairs in the great room.